The morning of March 15, 2024, began like countless others across the continental United States, with the familiar rhythm of Earth's rotation carrying the Terminator line westward at its steady 1,040 miles per hour. In New York City, commuters emerged from subway stations into the pale amber light of 6:47 a.m., their breath still visible in the lingering winter chill. Coffee shop windows glowed warmly against the pewter sky, and the first delivery trucks rumbled through streets slick with overnight frost. But something was wrong with the light itself. In Philadelphia, meteorologist Dr. Sarah Chen stood on the roof of the National Weather Service building, squinting through polarized sunglasses at the eastern horizon. The sun hung there like a dim copper coin, frozen at exactly 7 degrees above the horizon, the precise angle it should have occupied at dawn. But dawn had been 4 hours ago, and the sun hadn't moved. Not an inch, not an arc minute. The phones in weather stations across the eastern seaboard had been ringing incessantly since 4 a.m. Amateur astronomers, farmers, pilots, anyone who paid attention to the sky's daily choreography had noticed the same impossible thing. The sun had simply stopped. Not dimmed, not flickered, not changed color, just stopped, as if some cosmic projectionist had pressed pause on the universe's most fundamental motion. By 8 a.m. Eastern Time, the phenomenon's boundary had been mapped with chilling precision. From Maine to Florida, from the Atlantic coast to a razor-sharp line running roughly through Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and Jacksonville, the sun remained fixed in its early morning position. But cross that invisible meridian westward, and you entered a realm of perpetual night. In Chicago, it was 7 a.m. Central Time, and the sun should have been climbing toward its southeastern quadrant, painting Lake Michigan in shades of rose and gold. Instead, the city lay shrouded in a darkness so complete it seemed solid. Not the blue-black of normal night, tinged with starlight and the reflected glow of distant cities, but a profound, velvet darkness that swallowed even the most powerful streetlights after mere yards. The Willis Towers aircraft warning beacons appeared as faint red smudges, like dying embers in an infinite void. The temperature differential began almost immediately. Within 6 hours, meteorological stations along the boundary recorded temperature drops of 15 degrees on the dark side. Within a day, it was 30 degrees. The Great Lakes began to exhibit a phenomenon unlike anything in recorded history. The eastern portions, still kissed by the stationary sun's weak warmth, remained liquid, while their western expanses began to develop unprecedented ice formations. Lake Michigan became a study in stark contradiction. From its southern tip near Gary, Indiana, to roughly the latitude of Milwaukee, the lake's surface reflected the pewter sky like a tarnished mirror. But north of that line, in the perpetual night zone, ice began forming with supernatural speed. Not the typical inch-by-inch progression of winter freeze-up, but thick, architectural ice that crackled and boomed as it expanded, creating pressured ridges that thrust upward like frozen mountain ranges. The atmospheric consequences defied every model. The stationary sun created a persistent high-pressure system over the eastern states, while the sunless regions developed a polar vortex of unprecedented strength. The jet stream, that high-altitude river of air that governed North American weather, twisted into configurations that no meteorologist had ever seen. Storms spawned along the Terminator line with mechanical regularity, not the chaotic dance of normal weather systems, but a precise, almost algorithmic generation of supercells that marched along the boundary like sentries. In the first week, these storms were merely unusual. By the first month, they had become legendary. Tornadoes spawned with mathematical precision every 47 minutes along the light-dark boundary, each one exactly F3 intensity, each one lasting exactly 23 minutes, each one carving a path exactly 1.7 miles long. The debris from these storms created a literal wall of destruction, a rampart of twisted metal, splintered wood, and compressed earth that stretched from the Canadian border to the Gulf of Mexico. The biological responses began subtly. In the eastern zone, where the sun hung perpetually at dawn angle, photosynthesis continued but at drastically reduced efficiency. Plants began exhibiting behaviors never documented, leaves turned at impossible angles to capture the maximum weak light, and trees developed root systems that extended horizontally for hundreds of feet, creating underground networks that seemed almost neural in their complexity. In the dark zone, plant death wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable and strange. Chlorophyll didn't simply break down, it crystallized, turning leaves into brittle, jewel-like structures that chimed musically in the wind before crumbling into powder that glowed faintly green in ultraviolet light. Forests became crystalline cathedrals, their frozen canopies creating acoustic phenomena that travelers reported as the singing trees, harmonic frequencies generated by wind passing through countless crystal leaves. Animal migration patterns collapsed and reformed in ways that suggested a collective intelligence responding to the crisis. Birds didn't simply fly from dark to light. They began forming massive, organized formations that moved in precise spirals along the Terminator line. These formations, sometimes comprising millions of individuals across dozens of species, created their own weather systems. The beating of so many wings generated enough heat to create localized updrafts, and their synchronized movements produced infrasonic frequencies that could be detected by seismometers hundreds of miles away. Marine ecosystems faced an unprecedented challenge. The Atlantic Ocean's thermal regulation systems, dependent on solar heating, began to fail catastrophically. The Gulf Stream, that massive conveyor belt of warm water that moderated Eastern America's climate, stuttered and split. Part of it continued its ancient path, but part of it began flowing backward, creating a countercurrent that brought Arctic water south along the coast. The coastal waters of New York began exhibiting temperature inversions, where tropical fish swam in surface waters, while Arctic species populated the depths. Whales, their migration routes disrupted, began forming unprecedented gatherings in the transitional waters. These assemblies, comprising thousands of individuals from multiple species, created acoustic phenomena that Navy hydrophones detected as far away as Ireland, complex harmonic patterns that some researchers hesitantly described as structured communication. The human response was initially technological, then agricultural, then architectural, and finally, philosophical. The immediate crisis was energy. The dark zone's power grid, designed around predictable daily cycles, began failing within hours. Not from lack of generation, power plants continued running, but from demand spikes as every structure required constant artificial lighting. Heating systems worked overtime, and the psychological need for illumination drove consumption to unprecedented levels. Emergency lighting protocols, designed for temporary blackouts, proved catastrophically inadequate for permanent darkness. Street lamps that were meant to operate 12 hours per day burned out within weeks when forced to run continuously. The replacement bulbs, manufactured for normal use cycles, lasted even less time. Within a month, the dark zone's lighting infrastructure had collapsed into a patchwork of mismatched illumination sources, LED strips jerry-rigged car batteries, camping lanterns powered by portable generators, and an endless procession of candles that created their own environmental hazard as millions of tons of paraffin smoke accumulated in the stagnant air. Agriculture in the dark zone ceased entirely within 45 days. Not because plants died immediately, but because the complex biochemical processes that governed growth, reproduction, and nutrient absorption simply stopped functioning. Corn stalks stood frozen in their final moment of life, their cellular structure intact but inert, like botanical sculptures. Wheat fields became graveyards of perfectly preserved grain that would never ripen, each kernel containing exactly the amount of starch it held at the moment the sun stopped moving. The preserved nature of this death created a secondary crisis, decomposition. Without normal decay processes, failed crops didn't rot, they mummified. Vast agricultural regions became museums of crystallized vegetation, and the normal seasonal cycle of death and rebirth that enriched soil simply ceased. The earth itself began to change, developing a concrete-like hardness as organic matter fossilized in place. In the light zone, agriculture adapted with desperate innovation. Farmers learned to work with the oblique, unchanging light, developing new techniques for maximizing photosynthetic efficiency at the sun's permanent dawn angle. Mirrors, previously used only in the most specialized greenhouse operations, became as common as tractors. Entire fields were surrounded by carefully angled reflective surfaces that concentrated the weak sunlight into more useful intensities. The reflector farms created their own surreal landscape. Miles of mirrors, angled with mathematical precision, transformed the countryside into a geometric maze of light and shadow. These installations required constant maintenance, not just cleaning, but precise recalibration as seasonal changes affected the sun's exact position within its fixed dawn angle. Teams of technicians moved through the mirror fields like priests tending to solar altars, adjusting angles to the 10th of a degree based on calculations that occupied supercomputers around the clock. Urban environments faced different challenges. Cities in the light zone developed a strange, perpetual rush hour quality as residents learned to maximize their exposure to the weak sun. Office buildings were abandoned in favor of outdoor markets and sidewalk businesses. The entire concept of indoor-outdoor space blurred as architects hurriedly designed structures that were essentially transparent, glass walls, open roofing, and movable partitions that could be reconfigured hourly to track the optimal light angles. In the dark zone, cities became something unprecedented in human history, completely artificial environments. Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, major metropolitan areas that had hosted millions of people, transformed into elaborate stage sets where every surface had to be deliberately illuminated. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Humans, it turned out, had deep neurological dependencies on natural light cycles that went far beyond simple circadian rhythms. The first year saw a massive human migration unlike any in recorded history. It wasn't the chaotic flight of refugees, but a methodical, almost mechanical movement of populations. Families loaded moving trucks with the systematic efficiency of factory workers, creating convoys that stretched for hundreds of miles along the interstate highways that crossed the Terminator line. These highways became permanent traffic streams, rivers of headlights flowing eastward, carrying entire cities' worth of people toward the light. But not everyone left. Some communities in the dark zone made the conscious decision to adapt rather than abandon. These settlements developed technologies and social structures that were entirely new to human civilization. Artificial lighting evolved from simple illumination to complex systems that attempted to replicate natural circadian cycles. Buildings incorporated light therapy installations that provided precisely timed exposure to full-spectrum artificial sunlight. The psychological architectures that emerged were as innovative as the physical ones. Timekeeping in the dark zone couldn't rely on natural cues, so communities developed elaborate ritual schedules based on arbitrary but psychologically necessary markers. Bells rang every hour, not to mark time, but to mark the passage of time, to create the rhythmic heartbeat that human consciousness seemed to require. Work schedules became fluid and individualized. Without the natural synchronization of sunrise and sunset, each person developed their own internal rhythm. Some worked in traditional 8-hour blocks, others in 4-hour segments, still others in irregular bursts that matched their particular neurological needs. The concept of a workday gradually disappeared, replaced by a continuous, asynchronous economy where activity levels fluctuated in patterns that economists called metabolic commerce. The cultural implications unfolded over decades. Religion, which had always incorporated solar symbolism, faced theological crises that split denominations and spawned entirely new faiths. Some churches proclaimed the stationary sun a divine sign, interpreting the fixed dawn as representing eternal hope and resurrection. Others saw the darkness as judgment, leading to ascetic movements that forbade artificial light and demanded penitential existence in the natural night. New religions emerged that were explicitly technological, worshipping the engineering accomplishments that made life possible in the dark zone. These luminous orders developed quasi-scientific rituals around the maintenance of artificial lighting systems, creating priesthoods of electricians and engineers whose religious duties involved the sacred task of preventing darkness. Art underwent a revolution that touched every medium. In the light zone, painters developed techniques for capturing the eternal dawnlight, not just its appearance, but its psychological effect. Canvas size became crucial. Small paintings couldn't contain the expansive melancholy of permanent dawn, while large works risked overwhelming viewers already struggling with the unchanging light. Sculpture evolved toward kinetic forms that moved constantly, providing the visual change that the static sun no longer offered. These motion sculptures became essential to mental health, giving observers something to track visually when the sun no longer provided the deep psychological satisfaction of apparent movement across the sky. In the dark zone, art became purely artificial light-based. Painters worked with phosphorescent pigments and lead rays embedded in canvas. The traditional distinction between visual art and electrical engineering disappeared as artists learned to manipulate photons with the same precision their predecessors had used for pigments. Music evolved differently in each zone. Light zone compositions incorporated the persistent melancholy of endless dawn, developing harmonic structures that seemed to stretch infinitely without resolution, musical analogues to the frozen sun. Dark zone music became heavily rhythmic, providing the temporal structure that disappeared when day and night cycles ended. Percussion instruments became dominant, creating artificial heartbeats for communities that no longer had natural time cues. Architecture developed along radically different paths in each zone. Light zone buildings became increasingly transparent and movable, designed to channel and redirect the precious, limited sunlight. Walls became unnecessary for privacy since everyone spent maximum time outdoors anyway. Instead, structures focused on creating optimal solar exposure while providing wind protection and weather shelter. Dark zone architecture evolved toward enclosed, cocoon-like spaces that attempted to recreate not just the function but the psychology of natural environments. Buildings incorporated artificial weather systems, controlled air movements that simulated breezes, humidity systems that created the sensation of seasonal change, even acoustic installations that replicated outdoor soundscapes. The most remarkable architectural development was the creation of time buildings, structures designed to provide artificial temporal experiences. These buildings featured lighting systems that cycled through carefully choreographed sequences, dawn simulations, midday brightness, sunset colors, and nighttime dimming. Residents could experience compressed natural days within these buildings, with the entire cycle completing in periods ranging from 2 hours to traditional 24-hour schedules. Economic systems adapted through necessity. The dark zone's economy became almost entirely artificial, dependent on manufactured lighting, climate control, and synthetic environments. Traditional natural resource extraction became irrelevant. Instead, the economy focused on energy generation, light manufacturing, and the constant maintenance required for artificial life support systems. The light zone developed what economists called a solar economy, every aspect of production, distribution, and consumption arranged around maximizing the efficiency of limited, angled sunlight. Traditional timing of markets, transport, and manufacturing disappeared, replaced by systems that operated at whatever hours provided the best light conditions for each specific activity. Transportation networks underwent complete reorganization. The interstate highways that crossed the Terminator line became permanent migration routes, not just for the initial exodus, but for ongoing economic exchange between the zones. These highways required unprecedented maintenance as they carried constant traffic under conditions they weren't designed for, permanent artificial lighting in the dark zone, and the peculiar photochemical effects of eternal dawn light in the light zone. Rail systems proved more adaptable than highways. Trains could operate efficiently in complete darkness, and rail terminals became major economic hubs in dark zone cities. The rhythmic sound of trains, their predictable schedules and mechanical heartbeat, provided psychological benefits that went beyond simple transportation. Train travel became almost therapeutic for dark zone residents, offering controlled movement and temporal structure. Aviation faced unique challenges. Pilots had to learn entirely new navigation techniques for the dark zone, where traditional visual flight rules were impossible. Instrument flying became mandatory for all aircraft operations west of the Terminator line, and airports installed lighting systems so intensive they were visible from orbit. The boundary between light and dark zones became a major aviation hazard, as pilots crossing the line experienced sudden visual adjustments that caused spatial disorientation. Scientific research accelerated at an unprecedented pace, driven by the urgent need to understand what had happened and whether it could be reversed. Astronomical observations revealed that the phenomenon was entirely terrestrial. The Sun itself continued its normal nuclear processes, and Earth continued its orbital path around the Sun. But the planet's rotation, that fundamental characteristic that had governed terrestrial life for billions of years, had simply stopped. The physics of this stillness defied explanation. According to every law of planetary motion, a suddenly stopped rotation should have caused catastrophic atmospheric and oceanic disruptions. The momentum contained in Earth's spinning atmosphere and water should have continued moving at over 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, creating wind speeds that would have destroyed all surface life within hours. But these disasters didn't occur. The atmosphere stopped smoothly with the planet, as if some external force had carefully synchronized every molecule of air and water with the new rotational status. Ocean currents shifted and reformed, but without the violent mechanical disruptions that physics predicted. It was as if the entire Earth system had been gently guided into its new state by an intelligence that understood every interaction between spinning planet and fluid envelope. The magnetic field effects were equally mysterious. Earth's magnetic field, generated by the motion of molten iron in the planet's core, should have been catastrophically disrupted by the rotation stoppage. Instead, it remained stable but began exhibiting patterns never observed before, geometric regularities that suggested artificial control rather than natural geodynamic processes. Geologists studying seismic data from the moment of rotational stoppage found records that made no sense. The seismometers had detected a signal, not the violent jerking that should have accompanied such a massive mechanical change, but a smooth, almost musical frequency that lasted exactly 17 minutes and 13 seconds. This signal was identical at every seismometer on Earth, suggesting that whatever force had stopped the planet's rotation had done so with perfect simultaneity and infinite precision. Solar observatories, despite the Sun's fixed position, continued monitoring solar activity and found normal solar weather, sunspots, solar flares, and coronal mass ejections proceeding exactly as they had before the rotation stopped. But these events, which previously had affected Earth cyclically as the planet's rotation carried different regions through the solar wind, now affected only the light zone. The dark zone existed in a permanent solar shadow that somehow remained stable despite the Sun's continued nuclear variability. Climate modeling became a new scientific discipline. Traditional meteorology was based on the assumption of rotating atmospheric systems driven by differential solar heating as Earth turned, with one side permanently lit and the other permanently dark. Entirely new atmospheric circulation patterns emerged. These patterns were more complex than any models predicted, exhibiting what climatologists termed impossible stability. Weather systems that should have been chaotic instead displayed almost mathematical regularity. The Terminator line storms, those precisely timed tornadoes that formed every 47 minutes, became subjects of intensive study. Each storm was identical in intensity, duration, and path length. The mathematical precision was so exact that meteorologists could predict not just when and where each tornado would form, but the exact path it would take and the specific debris pattern it would create. This level of predictability in atmospheric phenomena had never been observed in natural weather systems. Biological research focused on adaptation mechanisms. In the light zone, plants developed extraordinary efficiency improvements, evolving cellular structures that could extract maximum energy from the oblique, unchanging sunlight. These adaptations occurred far too rapidly for normal evolutionary processes, suggesting that organisms were somehow accessing previously dormant genetic capabilities triggered by the extreme environmental change. Animals exhibited behavioral changes that implied complex cognitive adaptations. Nocturnal animals in the dark zone thrived initially, but then began showing signs of temporal disorientation when their natural prey disappeared. Diurnal animals in the light zone developed new social structures organized around optimal light usage rather than traditional territorial or mating patterns. The most remarkable biological discovery concerned human adaptation. Detailed medical studies found that people living in each zone began developing physiological changes within the first year. Light zone residents showed increased melanin production despite the weak sunlight, enhanced visual sensitivity to low light levels, and neurological changes that seemed to optimize brain function for the specific light conditions. Dark zone residents developed even more dramatic adaptations, enhanced night vision, improved tactile sensitivity, and altered sleep patterns that allowed for efficient rest without natural circadian cues. Most surprisingly, they began showing increased production of melatonin and serotonin through pathways that didn't require sunlight, as if their bodies were learning to manufacture essential neurochemicals through entirely new biological processes. By the 10th year, children born after the sun stopped showed adaptations that bordered on speciation. Light zone children had enlarged pupils, enhanced color discrimination, and brain structures that seemed specifically adapted for processing the eternal dawn light. Dark zone children had developed echolocation abilities, enhanced spatial memory, and social behaviors that suggested they were navigating their environment through sound and touch rather than vision. Language evolved in each zone to reflect the new realities. Light zone dialects developed extensive vocabularies for describing the subtle variations in eternal dawnlight, words for the exact color temperature at different atmospheric conditions, terms for the psychological effects of unchanging illumination, and grammatical structures that reflected the temporal strangeness of stopped time. Dark zone languages became heavily acoustic, incorporating sound mapping terminology and developing grammatical markers that indicated the speaker's location through acoustic reference points. These languages began using tonal elements that served navigational as well as communicative functions. Speakers could determine their listeners' position and movement through vocal cues. Written language in the dark zone evolved toward tactile systems even among the sighted population. Braille adaptations became common, but more interesting were entirely new writing systems that combined tactile and phosphorescent elements, texts that could be read by touch in complete darkness, but also provided visual information when light was available. Mathematical and scientific notation adapted to reflect the new physics of stopped rotation. Traditional astronomical calculations, based on Earth's movement, required complete revision. New mathematical frameworks emerged to describe the stationary planet's relationship to celestial mechanics, leading to advances in theoretical physics that wouldn't have been developed for centuries under normal conditions. The calendar system collapsed and reformed. Traditional timekeeping, based on solar and rotational cycles, became meaningless. Light zone communities adopted various systems. Some counted days from the moment the sun stopped. Day 1, day 365, day 3650. Others abandoned day counting entirely in favor of arbitrary time units based on local activities or artificial schedules. Dark zone communities developed even more innovative temporal systems. Without any natural time cues, they created artificial rhythms based on community activities, work cycles, or purely arbitrary but psychologically necessary counting systems. Some communities adopted emotional calendars, where time units were based on collective psychological states rather than astronomical events. International relations were forced to adapt to a world divided not by political boundaries, but by the fundamental environmental reality of light and darkness. The United Nations relocated to New York, which remained in the light zone, but established a secondary headquarters in Chicago to serve dark zone populations. This dual governance structure created unprecedented diplomatic complexities as representatives had to function in radically different environmental conditions. Trade relationships were completely restructured. Light zone regions became essential sources of agricultural products, while dark zone areas focused on manufacturing and energy production that didn't require natural light. The Terminator Line became the world's most important economic boundary, with massive infrastructure projects designed to facilitate constant movement of goods, people, and resources between the zones. Currency systems adapted to reflect the new economic realities. Traditional monetary systems, based on national boundaries and normal economic activities, proved inadequate for an economy divided by fundamental environmental conditions. New trading systems emerged based on energy credits, light allocation units, and timeshare arrangements for resources that could only be effectively used in one zone or the other. Education systems faced the challenge of preparing children for a world unlike any in human history. Light zone schools developed curricula focused on maximizing limited natural resources, sustainable living with reduced energy inputs, and the psychological skills needed to thrive with unchanging environmental conditions. Dark zone schools became almost entirely technical, focusing on engineering, artificial environment management, and the complex skills needed to maintain technological life support systems. But they also developed sophisticated programs in what educators called adaptive psychology, mental training designed to help humans thrive in completely artificial environments. The most innovative educational development was the creation of transitional schools located exactly on the Terminator Line. These institutions provided students with experience in both environmental zones, preparing them for careers that required functioning effectively in both light and dark conditions. Students in these schools became a unique population, equally adapted to both zones and serving as essential intermediaries in interzone communication and trade. Medical practice evolved to address health conditions that had never existed before. Light zone medicine focused on disorders related to constant, weak illumination, specific forms of depression linked to unchanging light, vision problems caused by permanent squinting against low-angle sun, and nutritional deficiencies related to limited agricultural variety. Dark zone medicine developed treatments for conditions related to complete absence of natural light, new forms of seasonal affective disorder that lasted year-round, spatial disorientation syndromes, and the complex psychological effects of living in entirely artificial environments. Medical research in the dark zone led to breakthroughs in understanding human circadian systems, ultimately developing treatments and therapies that proved beneficial even in normal light conditions. Pharmaceutical development accelerated as researchers studied the physiological adaptations occurring in each zone. Drugs that helped light zone residents process weak sunlight more efficiently, medications that supported the enhanced night vision developing in dark zone populations, and therapeutic compounds that eased the psychological stress of adapting to unprecedented environmental conditions. Dental health became a significant concern in the dark zone, where the absence of natural sunlight affected vitamin D synthesis and calcium absorption. Dental professionals developed new approaches to maintaining oral health without natural light, leading to innovations in mineral supplementation and artificial light therapy that had applications far beyond dentistry. Reproductive health showed interesting variations between zones. Birth rates in the light zone initially dropped as couples struggled with the psychological stress of unchanging dawn light, but then stabilized as communities adapted. Dark zone birth rates fluctuated more dramatically, with some communities showing increased fertility, possibly due to reduced light pollution affecting hormonal cycles, while others showed decreased fertility, possibly due to the stress of artificial living conditions. The children born in each zone showed distinct developmental patterns. Light zone children developed more slowly in some areas, but showed enhanced creativity and problem-solving abilities. Dark zone children showed accelerated development in spatial skills and sound-based learning, but sometimes struggled with visual processing when exposed to bright light. Pregnancy and childbirth required new medical approaches in each zone. Light zone maternity care focused on optimizing the weak natural light for maternal and fetal health, while dark zone obstetrics developed sophisticated artificial light therapy protocols for pregnancy management. Mental health services underwent complete restructuring to address the unprecedented psychological challenges. Traditional therapies, based on normal human environmental experience, proved inadequate for populations dealing with stopped time and artificial living conditions. New therapeutic approaches emerged that incorporated environmental modification, light therapy, and group counseling specifically designed for communities adapting to impossible circumstances. Support groups formed around shared adaptation experiences. Light zone residents dealing with dawn fatigue, the exhaustion of perpetual early morning light, found community with others experiencing the same temporal disorientation. Dark zone residents struggling with artificial environment syndrome developed mutual support networks that helped individuals cope with the psychological challenge of never experiencing natural conditions. The concept of mental illness itself required redefinition. Some behaviors that would have been considered pathological under normal circumstances, such as obsessive attention to artificial lighting or extreme sensitivity to minor environmental changes, were actually adaptive responses to the new conditions. Mental health professionals had to distinguish between maladaptive responses that required treatment and adaptive responses that should be supported and encouraged. Addiction patterns changed significantly in both zones. Traditional substance abuse often decreased as survival requirements demanded constant attention and community cooperation. However, new forms of addictive behavior emerged: obsessive light-seeking in the light zone, compulsive maintenance of artificial environments in the dark zone, and various forms of temporal obsession in both zones as people struggled to adapt to the absence of normal time cues. By the 50th year, distinct cultures had emerged in each zone that shared very little with pre-catastrophe civilization or with each other. Light zone culture developed around themes of persistence, endurance, and extracting meaning from unchanging conditions. Art, literature, and music in the light zone became meditative, focused on finding infinite variation within apparent sameness. Dark zone culture became intensely technological and collaborative, organized around the constant maintenance requirements of artificial life support. Art in the dark zone was kinetic and electronic, providing the sensory stimulation that the natural environment no longer offered. Literature became heavily audio-based, with spoken word performances becoming more culturally important than written texts. Social structures in each zone adapted to their specific environmental demands. Light zone communities developed around optimal use of limited natural resources, creating social hierarchies based on agricultural knowledge and sun efficiency expertise. Leadership roles went to individuals who could maximize community survival with minimal energy inputs. Dark zone communities organized around technological expertise and maintenance skills. Social status depended on the ability to maintain and improve artificial life support systems. Leadership was distributed among technical specialists, creating collaborative governance structures that could respond quickly to infrastructure needs. Marriage and family structures adapted differently in each zone. Light zone families tended toward smaller, more intensive units focused on efficient resource use and shared labor for agricultural activities. Extended families often lived in communal arrangements that maximized the use of limited lighting and heating resources. Dark zone families developed more flexible structures that could adapt to the irregular work schedules required for maintaining artificial environments. Child rearing became a community responsibility as parents worked unpredictable hours keeping life support systems operational. The traditional nuclear family was often replaced by child care cooperatives and multi-adult households organized around technical specializations rather than kinship. Religious and philosophical developments in each zone reflected their environmental realities. Light zone spirituality focused on themes of eternal dawn, perpetual hope, and finding meaning in unchanging circumstances. Many light zone religious movements developed around the idea that the stopped sun represented a divine pause, a spiritual opportunity for humanity to reflect and grow without the distraction of normal temporal change. Dark zone spirituality became more technological and communal, often incorporating the maintenance of artificial environments as sacred duty. Some dark zone religious movements developed around the idea that humanity had been chosen to transcend natural limitations, with the darkness representing an opportunity to become purely technological beings freed from dependence on natural cycles. Philosophical schools emerged that were entirely new to human thought. Stop-time philosophy developed complex theories about the nature of temporal experience and meaning when natural cycles disappeared. Artificial environment ethics grappled with questions about the moral implications of creating completely synthetic living conditions. The most sophisticated philosophical development was zone duality theory, the idea that humanity had been divided into two distinct evolutionary paths, each adapted to radically different environmental conditions. These theories raised profound questions about whether light zone and dark zone populations would remain the same species over extended time periods. Educational philosophies diverged significantly. Light zone education emphasized patience, endurance, and the ability to find meaning in subtle variations within apparent sameness. Students learned to appreciate minute changes in light quality, small variations in agricultural yields, and the psychological skills needed for thriving in unchanging conditions. Dark zone education became intensely practical and technological, focused on the skills needed to maintain artificial environments and the psychological resilience required for living without natural environmental cues. Students learned engineering, psychology, and community organization skills that would have been considered advanced specializations under normal circumstances. The most innovative educational development was cross-zone studies, academic programs that required students to spend time in both environments, developing the rare ability to function effectively in both light and dark zones. These programs produced individuals who became essential for interzone communication, trade, and cultural exchange. By the 100th year, linguistic drift had progressed to the point where light zone and dark zone populations were developing mutually incomprehensible languages. Light zone languages had evolved extensive vocabularies for describing subtle variations in unchanging conditions, while dark zone languages had become heavily technical and acoustic-based. Translation between zones required specialists who had trained in both environments and could understand not just the linguistic differences but the completely different conceptual frameworks that each zone had developed. These translators became culturally crucial figures, maintaining the communication links that prevented the zones from becoming entirely separate civilizations. The arts had evolved into forms that would have been unrecognizable to pre-catastrophe humans. Light zone art focused on infinite variation within severe constraints, paintings that explored every possible variation of dawn light, music that found complex harmonies within narrow tonal ranges, and literature that discovered profound meaning in apparently repetitive circumstances. Dark zone art became entirely electronic and kinetic, incorporating artificial lighting, sound generation, and movement as primary artistic media. Traditional visual arts disappeared almost entirely, replaced by multimedia installations that provided comprehensive sensory experiences designed to compensate for the absence of natural environmental stimulation. Performance art in both zones became crucial for community mental health. Light zone performances were meditative and endurance-based, helping communities cope with the psychological challenge of unchanging conditions. Dark zone performances were intense and technology-based, providing the sensory stimulation that natural environments no longer offered. Literature in both zones had evolved away from traditional narrative structures. Light zone literature became philosophical and contemplative, focusing on internal experience and the discovery of meaning within apparent stasis. Dark zone literature became technical and collaborative, often taking the form of instruction manuals that incorporated artistic elements. The most remarkable literary development was the emergence of cross-zone epic, collaborative works created by authors from both zones, incorporating the different perspectives and experiences of each environment. These works became essential cultural artifacts that maintained some sense of shared human experience across the environmental divide. Scientific research had advanced in directions that wouldn't have been possible under normal conditions. The fixed astronomical relationships allowed for observations and experiments that required perfectly stable reference points. Dark zone laboratories, freed from the interference of natural light cycles, made breakthroughs in areas requiring controlled artificial conditions. Light zone research focused on maximizing efficiency in low-energy systems and understanding the biological and psychological adaptations that humans and other organisms were undergoing. This research led to advances in sustainable living, biological adaptation, and the psychology of environmental stress that had applications far beyond the specific zone conditions. The most significant scientific development was the discovery that the force responsible for stopping Earth's rotation was still active and still maintaining the stopped state. Sensitive instruments detected a continuous energy input that exactly balanced the various forces that should have caused the planet to resume rotation. This discovery raised profound questions about the source and purpose of this intervention. Research into the nature of this stabilizing force revealed that it operated through mechanisms that didn't fit any known physics. The energy input was precisely calibrated to maintain not just rotational stasis, but also atmospheric and oceanic stability, magnetic field consistency, and even biological system support. The level of understanding required to provide such precise intervention suggested intelligence far beyond human capabilities. By the 200th year, the human populations in each zone had developed physiological differences that constituted separate subspecies. Light Zone humans had evolved enhanced low-light vision, improved efficiency in vitamin D synthesis from weak sunlight, and neurological adaptations that allowed them to function effectively with unchanging environmental cues. Dark Zone humans had developed enhanced night vision, improved spatial navigation abilities, and altered circadian systems that functioned effectively without natural light cycles. Most remarkably, they had developed new forms of echolocation and enhanced tactile sensitivity that allowed them to navigate effectively in complete darkness. The children born in each zone showed these adaptations in enhanced form. By the third generation, Light Zone children had visual systems specifically adapted to eternal dawn conditions, while Dark Zone children were born with enhanced night vision and spatial navigation abilities that allowed them to function effectively in artificial environments from birth. Genetic studies revealed that these adaptations were occurring through mechanisms that operated much faster than traditional evolution. Rather than random mutations slowly selected by environmental pressure, the changes appeared to involve the activation of previously dormant genetic capabilities that allowed rapid adaptation to extreme environmental conditions. Interbreeding between zones produced children with remarkable abilities to function in both environments, but these individuals were rare due to the practical difficulties of maintaining relationships across such different living conditions. The few zone-crossed individuals who existed became valuable as intermediaries and translators between the increasingly different zone cultures. Medical research had advanced to the point of developing treatments that could help individuals adapt to the opposite zone conditions. Light Zone residents could receive treatments that enhanced their night vision for temporary visits to the Dark Zone, while Dark Zone residents could receive therapies that improved their tolerance for natural light. The most advanced medical development was the creation of environmental adaptation therapy, treatments that could help individuals transition from one zone to the other permanently. These therapies involved genetic modification, physiological conditioning, and psychological training that allowed people to adapt to radically different environmental conditions. By the 300th year, the two zones had developed entirely separate civilizations that maintained only minimal contact. Trade continued across the Terminator line, but it had become a formal diplomatic process between essentially different species rather than simple commerce between